morning. How is everyone? This last week was so amazing to watch VBS. It felt like one of the most just normal things in the last 6 months, even though it was so different. But to just think about the rich history of how long VBS has happened here, and to see kids out running around in the field, and to be able to have that time with them, but also remember the time that so many of us had when we were growing up at church, the various things that you got to do that gave you that first exposure to God, to community, to friendships. That shit was just a really powerful thing. And so I'm just really thankful of God's blessing on that time. This morning, I wanted to share with you guys from the book of Matthew, because I thought that there was just so much that translated to some of the emotions and different feelings that we had right now. And also because of the way that Jesus talks about blessing in some of the areas of our life that we would never think that it actually transpires. And so I'm going to read this for you guys again from Matthew. It says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those that mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So before we get into this, I want to give a little bit of a backstory just to the Bible and some of the structure of the way that it's put together. So we have the Old Testament and the New Testament, which we read together, but both of those different sections of the Bible start with a very important thing. In the Old Testament, it is the Pentateuch, which simply means 5 books, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's also called the Torah as well. And those are the books of the law and kind of the foundation of faith. The story of creation, the story of God taking his people and teaching them about who he is. In the New Testament, we have the Gospels, which are 4 different accounts of Jesus' life that are written by 4 different people. Now, they are ordered in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they didn't necessarily get written in that order. It's actually much more likely that Mark was the first one that was written. And each one of the Gospels has a certain particular way that it was put together. Now, Mark and Luke are really interesting because they weren't written by disciples of Jesus, but they were written by people who were companions of those who had a direct relationship with Jesus. So Mark, the first one, was good friends with Peter, who of course was a very important disciple to Jesus, an important person in the church legacy going on past Jesus' resurrection. Mark's intent when he was writing was to just give the foundation and the basics. Mark didn't talk about Jesus' childhood. He didn't talk about anything after his resurrection. He starts with his baptism. He talks about his teaching, his life, his death, and his resurrection. Now, Luke is actually one giant narrative that goes with the book of Acts. And he actually says in the very beginning of this, he talks about his purpose. In the beginning of Luke, it says, "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They use the eyewitness reports circulating among us from early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so that you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught." So Luke's gospel is also the most chronological one, because it was likely that Jesus was the kind of person who taught messages over and over again. And it's why there are slight variations in some of the different stories and parables that you read. They tell the same narrative, and they have the same point. But from hearing those stories, like if we sat down together and we heard someone tell a parable over and over, maybe over the course of a couple years, and then I told you that parable, and then someone else sat down and told you that parable, it might have a different flavor from it because we're all hearing these things over and over. So with Luke, he has an audience that he's speaking to, which is a Gentile audience, one that might not know the Jewish customs and history and tradition as richly. And so in his narrative, he takes time to try to explain some of those things for them and make them more accessible. Now, Matthew, on the other hand, was writing particularly to a Jewish audience. And so it has that knowledge, and it has things that would be key for Jewish listeners and readers to understand. And before I get into that, I'll just cover John's, because John is an interesting gospel because it's very different, and it was written at a much later time. It's almost as if John, seeing those other narratives there, said, there's more of the story that I want to tell. And it's why it's the most different in tone and has different stories than some of the other gospels as well, too. But today, we are looking at John. And so, as I said, it was written for a Jewish audience. And so there's a couple things right from the beginning that kind of set that off. It says, this is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. So right off the tree, Matthew is letting his readers know, because Abraham and David were such important people in the genealogy of who the Messiah was going to be, that he wanted to let them know where Jesus came from, and they would understand the importance of those two figures within there. It's also the reason why when Herod found out that there was a Messiah, he asked the Jewish scholars about their texts, and they told him from what was prophesied in Micah, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the rulers, the ruling of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd of my people. And so the Gospel of Matthew is going to emphasize a lot of Old Testament text. And that's where we start getting into this. Now, for chapter 5, specifically what we're looking at, these Beatitudes, they're called, they're these blessings. They have a root in wisdom literature, most often what we see in the Psalms. And so when you look back and you read through some of the Psalms, they have the same kind of structure and the same kind of language. The very first Psalm, Psalm 1, verses 1 through 3 said, "Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but those who delight in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night." Again, in Psalm 144, "Blessed is the people of whom this is true. Blessed is the people whose God is the Lord." And so these blessings were a part of something that got put into their life a lot, saying that when you are close to God, it is a blessed life. There are things that come out of this relationship and this focus. Now, there's something really interesting about this structure of these Beatitudes, these 8 different blessings that are given. And it's something that is a literary structure that's called inclusio. And what it means is that when the first and the last of this particular poetry refer to the same thing, they mean that everything that's in the middle also refers to it. So the very first blessing talks about the kingdom of God, and the very last one talks about the kingdom of God. Therefore, all of those different blessings, they're actually talking about God's kingdom and what it is to be blessed in God's kingdom. So we have to talk about God's kingdom a little bit. And by the way, I'm sorry, I'd like to tell you guys these scriptures so that you can open up and see them for yourself. This message has so many different references in it. If you're really interested, this is the kind where I wrote everything down, and I'd be happy to share it with you, because it's just one giant narrative that's all put together, because it's too hard to flip a Bible back and forth for so many different little verses. So, God's kingdom. This is brought about first. The first one who talks about it is John the Baptist, as he's preparing the way for Jesus. He says, "Repent, because the kingdom of God is near." Last week I had a chance to speak at VBS, and I talked about that word repent, and what it means is to stop and to reevaluate your life. And we spoke about how Paul was a perfect example of that, because Paul was going down one path, and it was a path that was not leading towards goodness. He was very opposed to Christianity, and not only did he approve of the killing of Christians, he set off on a mission to go and arrest them and bring them back to Jerusalem where they could be tried. And as he's doing that, and he's on his way to Damascus, Jesus interacts with him, and he's blinded, and Paul can't see. And Jesus talks to him, and he says, Paul, why are you persecuting me?" And Paul has this experience. And through that, he changes course. He stops and he evaluates his life, and he goes in a completely different direction and ends up setting a totally different course for his own life and for the life of the church because of that choice. And so John says, stop and rethink this because, and this is the key, because God's kingdom is near. Now, when we think about God's kingdom, the easiest way to picture it is a picture of heaven. But the thing is that John says it's not just there, it's here. That God doesn't just live far away in a place that you'll be at someday. God is actually here, present in your life. And of course, he's foreshadowing the Messiah coming, saying he's actually here with you right now. And so when we imagine God's kingdom, what he's saying is that picture God's goodness, picture God's order, picture the world set right in a way where we were functioning the way that we were meant to. We were living and loving and caring and relating to one another in the exact rhythms that God had set for us. And now know that that is possible and is desired in your life right here and right now. That's God's kingdom. That's what we want to talk about. God is not confined to heaven, but he is present in your life. And so that's really the key and the big reveal in this, is that when Jesus specifically talks about God's kingdom, he's talking about something that's very active and present that we want to be a part of. What's interesting is that Peter and Paul and John, all at different times as they are writing letters and trying to communicate with the churches that they have congregations at and community with, they all have to remind them of this pretty often. Because it's easy for people to get their focus totally on heaven and stop to look at the things around them, to stop worrying about the justice of what will happen right now because God will set everything right later on, to stop worrying about the stewardship of the things that are right in front of us because God's going to set all of that right eventually, and to think, I don't need to be very active as a Christian because it's all coming right around the corner, right? It's just something that if you look back through Christian history happens all the time, is that it's easy to go, it's probably the end right now, and so therefore I should just get through this and just wait for God to set everything right. But all of those authors and all those people who had influences over the Gospels and different congregations that they wrote to reminded us, no, the kingdom is something that's active in your life right now that you want to be a part of. And so the other interesting thing about this kingdom, as Jesus starts to describe it, is that it is very different than the world around us. It's been referred to before as an upside down kingdom. And what I mean are some of these different passages here. In Matthew 18, it says, at that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 19, Jesus says, at the renewal of all things, many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. He also gives this longer parable where he's talking about a landowner, Jesus is, and he says, for the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius. He told them, you also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right. So they went. He went out again at about noon, and then at about 3, and did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. He asked them, why have you been standing here all day doing nothing? Because no one has hired us. You also go and work in my vineyard. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired, going on to the first. And the workers who came and who were hired first, they expected to receive more. But each of them also received the same as those that came last. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have had the burden of work all day and the heat of the day? But he answered one of them, I'm not being unfair to you, friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Don't I have the right to do with what I want with my money? Or are you envious because I am generous? So the last will be first, and the first will be last. And so Jesus is just showing us that if we just look to the world and say, this is the way it is, we would say, well, those who have the most are the most successful. Those who have the most power, those who have the most talent, those who have the best history and the best place they come from. We look to all these other various things and we say, those are going to be the most successful people, those are the most important people. And Jesus is always pointing us towards the heart and saying, no, this is something that is much bigger than just what you see on the outside. And all of that sets us up so that when Jesus starts going into these blessings, it would seem confusing unless we understand where he's coming from, that he is explaining a kingdom that is different than this world, a kingdom that is reflective of his Father, and a kingdom that has been coming for a long time and that they would have been looking for and anticipating. So let's talk about these. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Now, this word poor doesn't necessarily just mean that a person who doesn't have any monetary possessions. And a really great example of that is with David, because this word poor is actually derived from ponchos, which is meaning someone who is completely dependent on another for survival. So King David, who is referenced in that genealogy, is a very interesting start to becoming a king, because God tells him that he's going to become a king before he actually does. And what happens is it starts to become very evident to all of those around him. He's very successful in everything that he does, and the current king, Saul, becomes very jealous of David, and he wants to actually take his life. And David at one point is running for his life, and he has to go to his enemy. And while he's there, the way that he gets away with it, because if you think David is this strong warrior and he goes up to his enemy and he's completely helpless and he's there in front of him, that would be a great opportunity for him to take David out. He's defenseless. And so what does David do? He acts like an insane person. He acts totally crazy so that the man has sympathy on him and doesn't kill him. And David later, while he's writing in the Psalms, he says this in Psalm 34, verse 4. He says, I sought the Lord and he answered me. He delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. This poor man called and the Lord heard him. He saved him from all of his troubles. That's David calling himself a poor man. He's saying, I was at the end of my rope. I didn't have anything left. There was no way that I could survive, and I had to depend on God. So when Jesus says those who are poor in spirit, he's not meaning someone that's completely dejected. He's not meaning someone that's just living in poverty. He's saying that when you get to a place where the only thing that you can count on is God, he says, I am there with you. You are part of the kingdom of heaven at that point when you are totally dependent on me. Verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Mourning is an interesting one because you can't mourn unless you care. You have to really care for something to grieve it. And so I think that a wonderful example of this is with Mary, because after Jesus is killed, she immediately, as soon as she can, she wants to go and she wants to be there at the grave. And so in Matthew 28, it says, after the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came forward from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were as white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him, they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, he is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he is. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. Then you will see him. Now I have told you. So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and they will see me. They were mourning, and Jesus says, those who mourn will be comforted. Now, of course, that means two different things. It's talking about comfort when God sets everything right eventually, but also we're looking for comfort in this kingdom that we're a part of right now. And so we can actively look for that comfort, and more importantly, we can actively be a source of comfort for those who are mourning. And this is definitely, certainly a time where we are mourning so many different people in our country and across the world who have died in this pandemic. We're mourning the ways that our lives have been changed and upended so much. We're mourning the fact that we don't know what is completely normal and we don't understand when it's going to go back. We know people who have lost their jobs, their income, their livelihood. There is a lot to mourn about. And so it's comforting to hear Jesus say that in his kingdom, those who will mourn will be comforted. And when I hear that, I specifically hear a call to say, comfort those who you see are mourning in your lives. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. This one's an interesting one because we don't use the word meek very much. And in fact, the ways that it's used in our vernacular right now are really sort of about a submissive person who might not stand for much, sort of be the lowly one. But in fact, the Greek word for this, praeus, it was a term that was used for war horse training when they needed the animals to be strong but gracious and willing to go where needed. I read a really interesting quote that said it could be viewed as something between reckless and cowardice. So I think a really interesting example of meekness in the Bible comes from John, the disciple. In his gospel, in the 19th chapter, it says, near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, woman, here is your son, and to the disciple, here is your mother. And from that time on, the disciple took him into his home. Now, John hadn't been perfect. All of the disciples had abandoned Jesus in Gethsemane when the crowds first came for him and when he was first arrested. But John went back. He's the only one who sat there at the cross while Jesus was dying. And I'm sure that he knew at that point that that could have meant his own death as well. But he found the courage. He found something between cowardice and recklessness to go and to be with Jesus in those final moments. And he was blessed because of that. And John became a very incredible and important person in our church history because of what he's done through his writings and through his example. And so, can you be humble and can you have a true and honest view of yourself? Remember, this is the upside down picture of the kingdom, because when we think of those that would inherit the earth or rule the world or outlast everyone, we think of warriors, those who are the strongest, smartest, and most brave. But God said it is in fact the meek that will make it to the very end. Now, blessed are those who will who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Another way that this is commonly translated is those who thirst for justice. Now, when I thought about this one, I thought about Peter. Because Peter sometimes is, I find, one of the most relatable disciples because he has such a deep energy and passion for God. He gets ahead of himself a lot. In Matthew, there is a point where Jesus asked the disciples, who are people saying that I am? How do people explain what they see happening right now? And they have a lot of different answers for all of that. And then Peter says, well, you're the Messiah. It's this amazing, profound moment where it's broken through for Peter and he understands that he is talking with the Lord. And then just a few verses later, there's a point where Jesus starts to talk to them about the scriptures and he says, you know that the Messiah has to be sacrificed. And Peter, again, and I get it, out of his passion and his love for Christ, he goes, no, I don't want this to happen. And Jesus has to rebuke him and say, get behind me, Satan. Like, you are a distraction to me right now, and you're not following this trajectory and this, all that has been written. You don't know the story in this moment. I get it that you love me, but you're in the wrong now because you haven't done everything to understand that's going there, and you just are so excited about it. And I can definitely relate to that feeling of being so passionate that you just jump out ahead of yourself. But Jesus says, be thirsty and be hungry for the rightness of God, for justice. And I certainly think that that is a huge theme of what we see happening all across the world right now, is that people want justice. Yes, there's lots of different definitions of what that means, and there is lots of different things that are happening all around, but it is a feeling that you feel permeating, that people are saying, I want to live in a just world. And I think that that is a good thing. And of course, we turn our eyes to Jesus when we're looking for righteousness, because ultimately, and especially here, the word righteousness is used as the rightness of God. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Compassion or forgiveness shown towards someone whom it is within one's power to punish or harm. So you have to be in a position over someone, have some sort of leverage over someone to be able to initiate mercy. And of course, we see this example most from God and his attitude towards us. I thought there was one really interesting example of this as well, too, in a short little book in the Bible. At the very end, it's written by Paul in Philemon. And this is it just has one chapter, and in verses 17 through 19, Paul is speaking to him, and he says, if you consider me a partner, welcome him, and he's talking about his friend, as you would welcome me. If he has done you any wrong or owes you anything, charge it to me. Paul, I am writing this with my own hand. So what happened was that Philemon had a slave, and this man ran away from him. And it sounds like when he ran away from him, he stole some things from him. And then he ends up meeting Paul a little bit later and becomes friends with Paul and actually converts and becomes a Christian. And Paul is writing back to Philemon, and what he's asking for is mercy. He's saying, this person is infinitely valuable. He's valuable to me, he's valuable to you, he's valuable to God, he has found God, and I'm asking you to forgive him and to have mercy. And if you need anything, charge it to my account. That's an incredible picture of mercy there. And I think that mercy could do a lot in our culture today, and in the back and forthness of looking for every single wrong within people. I think that's one of the challenges of living online and living socially so much, is that we're not face to face. And so we don't talk to people online the ways that we talk in person. We don't say things, and we don't try to dig up things in the same way when you're actually looking and interacting with another human being. But I think it's a place where that concept of mercy, not hitting back, or when you have something that could be damaging to another person, withholding that for the sake of mercy, that's a place where we distinguish that we're a part of a kingdom that is trying to be something different. We're not just following the rhythms of the way that the world does, because when someone hits you, you hit them back. But we're saying, no, God has been merciful to me, so therefore I can be merciful to others. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. How often, when you're looking through the New Testament, do you see Jesus talk about the heart? He gives several different examples of this. I think one that's really powerful is when he's talking about a cup. And he said, if you clean the outside of the cup, it looks nice to everyone else, but if you don't clean the inside, then every time you take a drink of something, it's going to taste disgusting because it hasn't been cleaned. That's the actual important part, is what's going on inside of you, what you're putting inside of you. Don't just worry about the outside of the cup. And so this focus on one's heart, this is what allowed Jesus to see things in people that other people didn't see. And I think that a great example of this is Matthew himself, because Matthew was a tax collector. And tax collectors were completely despised within the Jewish culture in Jesus' day. So the Romans had this very ingenious way of keeping a nation down, keeping them suppressed. And so one of the ways that you do that is you create division within that group that you have power over, so that they can't necessarily join and lock hands with everyone, because they actually don't want to be with some of those people in their group. So what they did was they hired Jews within the nation of Israel to be tax collectors. And they had basically no restrictions on how they needed to collect money. So imagine that you are living under oppression, and then you get a knock on your door, and it's time to pay up your taxes, and it's not a Roman soldier who shows up, but it's your neighbor. And he says, I gotta collect this money. Well, you start to look at them as a traitor. You start to think of them as less than that. And then what happens when people look at you like that? When every single day you have to walk through the marketplace and you see people looking down and turning away from you, you start to go, well, maybe I am gonna slough a little bit more off the top. No one's watching this. Why don't I take an extra 5%? Why don't I take an extra 10%? And it breeds distrust and all of this. And the Romans knew that. That's why they did things like this. So tax collectors were very despised in that culture. And Matthew was a tax collector. But Jesus looks at the heart. He doesn't look at just the outside of a person. And so he walks by the marketplace and he sees Matthew in his tax collector's booth. And he says, I gotta have dinner at your place tonight. I gotta spend some time with you. And Matthew actually becomes a disciple of Jesus and one of these 12 very special people that we remember and honor and listen to, and then in fact ends up writing not only the gospel, but the one that is specifically for the nation of Israel. I think that focus on the inside of the cup, again, it correlates very well to the very last one about mercy and how we think about one another and how we recognize the things that are going on in one another's heart, and looking past just the surface level stuff, looking past just the tweets and just the posts and the quick sayings and all of that, but taking time. And I know it's hard in this environment to get to know one another because we either have to do it distance or we have to do it through a computer or something like that. And it's just hard because we used to be able to just, do you want to get a cup of coffee? Do you want to come over for dinner? So we have to work extra hard at that, but that doesn't take away the fact that these are blessings that God is saying for us. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And that is what I think is a wonderful part about it, for they will see God. Because when you focus on making a good presentation of yourself, your focus is where? It's on you. When you focus on making God look good, where are you looking? You're looking to God. And so when looking inside your heart, who do you see? Yourself, or do you see God? God says that the pure in heart see him. Blessed are the peacemakers. This is a person who brings about peace, especially by reconciling adversaries. So I talked about that story about Paul before, and a really interesting piece about this is that when Paul was blinded, God sent him off to Ananias. And God comes to Ananias in a vision while Paul's coming there, and he says, look, I am sending someone named Paul to you, and he's blind, and I need you to pray for him so that he can see again. And Ananias goes, wait, isn't this the guy who has been killing Christians? Isn't this the one who's been pulling them off into prison? And God says, yeah, that's him. And I want you to bless him. Now, what an interesting position that Ananias was in right there. Sort of like the king when David comes to him. This could potentially be a place where you can knock down one of your adversaries, or you can just say no, don't give him the blessing. But Ananias is a peaceful man, and he's recognized by God for what he has already done. And so God says, I want to use you to bless him. And instead of this being another division because they come from different worlds, Ananias uses this as a time to make peace within the Christian family, inviting someone who seems so far out of it into it, and literally using his hands to bring that about so that Paul could be blessed by that. And I think that we could definitely use more peacemakers in the world. We've all felt it in the last few years, how somehow the different ways that we think and our approaches to life and our politics about life and everything, it's something has just caused us to see that we have very different ways of viewing the world. But the thing is that diversity could be a huge blessing because it allows us to see a bigger vision for the world. And yet we find ourselves really trapped in it, making us think about others as other, as different. And I want to be a peacemaker in the world because they will be called the children of God. And ultimately, that is certainly where I want to be. When Jesus says, call the children, I'll show you who's in God's kingdom. It's these little kids. And that's one thing that's so wonderful about when you watch kids play. They don't think about all those various things they do. You want to play? I do too. Great, let's be friends. Best friends forever. It's an amazing thing that kids are able to do because they're not focused on all the various things that we are. And that doesn't mean that we don't have to take responsibility for our lives and the ways that we have to live as adults and responsibilities. But that peacemaker aspect of it is something that I think could absolutely come in the world right now and would be amazing. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Righteousness, to stand up for what is right in God's eyes. Paul says this in an interesting way in Philippians 4, verses 8. He says, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, lovely, admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about these things. Again, he goes on in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22. He says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And most importantly, against such things there is no law. Just being a good person generally doesn't get you thrown in prison. And that is a wonderful thing. Being a peaceful person, being kind, being gentle, these are things that we can practice, and they pretty much only bring goodness into the world. And that's what we're trying to get at the heart of what the kingdom is a reflection of God's rule in our lives, in our very lives right now. It's interesting to notice that when it talks about those who stand up for righteousness, it's not necessarily an aggressive thing. And I think this is important to point out because there are some ways where we can take these things and we can make them aggressive. Again, another example is Peter, who I think just had so much passion in his heart. Sometimes he moved with his feet before his head. When he sees that Jesus is being arrested, he grabs a sword and he cuts off the ear of one of the people who's coming after Jesus. Now, you'd think that that sounds like a pretty righteous thing. This is the Son of God. Peter knows it. He's already acknowledged it, and Jesus has affirmed it to him. He sees that he is getting drugged off for something that he did not do and knows that he is probably going to be killed for this, and he thinks, I need to stop this. I need to stand in the way of this. And yet Jesus says, put down your sword. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And so as we are striving for righteousness, I think it is important to point out that there are those times where it seems like strong action is needed for something, and those are the times we need to really prayerfully go to God and understand, are our actions in line with that full picture of what God's saying? And that's why ultimately, as we come to the end of these Beatitudes, it's important to note that these all things work together. Then when it talks about standing up for righteousness, it also is saying that meekness is a part of it. And those two things might not seem like they go together, but when you put them all in the same place, you start to see a picture, I think, of Jesus. In the ways that there were times where he stood up for justice and he said, this isn't right and this needs to change. And there are times where he was gentle, just kneeling down and letting the children come and sit with them. There were the times where he was just teaching with his disciples alone up on a hill, just having brotherhood and having community and having love. There are times where he is working powerfully in the world, calling the winds and the waves to settle down so that he can get on with his mission there. There are so many different pieces, and we have to look at all of them together because they work together. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now this is really interesting when you read the last part, and it says, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Who are the prophets talking to? They're talking to the nation of Israel. Who was it that persecuted the prophets? It was the Israelites. How often do we fight against those who are within the church? How often do we look at another denomination or another movement or another sect within Christianity and we think, I don't know if we're on the same page. And I'm not talking about small disagreements, I'm talking about larger things, and especially throughout history. Our Christian history is the time of Reformation. There was a time where we used to kill each other over our differences. So we have progressed very far, and that's a wonderful thing to see. But yet still, how often is our infighting getting in the way of us moving forward God's kingdom together? Again, that diversity that allows us to see more. And what's really cool about this community, and what I love here at Plain, and my experience of being here and growing up in this community and in this church, is that this really is a community church. And that I see diversity here working in wonderful ways to cause us to come together. And I've seen and experienced so many amazing conversations. People have come from all different kinds of backgrounds here. I've seen Catholics here, I've seen Orthodox Christians here. I've seen people from just about every different place coming in, and we stand up and we ask them to share where they're from if they have the courage to do so. We get to see so many different people who come through just because we live in this tourist economy. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing. And that's what I think Jesus is getting at the heart of this, is just saying, even within yourselves, look for peace, look for common ground, look for the ways that you can walk forward and live in God's kingdom together. So I'll end. I'm going to read this whole thing to you again. I'm going to read a different version, though, just because it's fascinating, his way of looking at this. This is from the Message version of this. And if you don't know the story of Eugene Peterson, who wrote the Message, what's fascinating about him is that he was a pastor for 30 years before he became the Eugene Peterson that wrote the Message and became a world-renowned historian and wrote all these books that did so well and all those various kinds of things. He was just a pastor of a small church back east. And so even his approach to the Message, I read his autobiography last year, and he said, really, it was the Message it's a book that's the Bible for pastors, from a pastor to a pastor. Here's a really simple way of putting this. Even in his introduction to it, he said that I think that the Message is the kind of thing that is meant to be read alongside other scriptures. I'm trying to make this a really accessible language so that it gets people excited about going deeper into it. And so there's a few times where I'm reading it and I just think, oh, I love the way that you phrased that. And so I will end by reading Matthew 5, verses 3 through 12 again, out of this version. It says, "You're blessed when you're at the end of your rope. With less of you, there is more of God and his rule. You're blessed when you feel you've lost what is most dear to you. Only then can you be embraced by the one most dear to you. You're blessed when you're content with just who you are, no more, no less. That's the moment you find yourselves proud owners of everything that can't be bought. You're blessed when you've worked up a good appetite for God. He's food and drink in the best meal you'll ever eat. You're blessed when you care. At the moment of being careful, you find yourself cared for. You're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and your heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family. You're blessed when your commitment to God provokes persecution. The persecution drives you even deeper into God's kingdom. And finally, not only that, count yourselves blessed every time people put you down or throw you out or speak lies about you to discredit me. What it means is that the truth is too close for comfort, and they are uncomfortable. You can be glad when that happens. Give a cheer even, for though they don't like it, I do. And all heaven applauds. And know that you are in good company. My prophets and witnesses have always gotten into this kind of trouble. And so, God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the chance to sit here in this field openly and just talk about you and sing songs to you. We thank you for the ways that you have blessed our children last week through Vacation Bible School and just through all the years of the ways that you have watched little ones grow up. And we just ask your blessing on our lives here, on our children, and on the continued history of this special place that you have blessed. Amen.